Imagine this. It is the middle of the night. The Great Plains stretch out in every direction, endless and white, swallowed by darkness so complete that you cannot tell where the earth ends and the sky begins. The wind does not blow here. It tears. It screams across the open land like something alive, something hungry, driving the temperature down past 30 below zero. Outside, the snow is not falling. It is moving, sideways, brutal, relentless, carving the frozen ground into shapes that will be gone by morning. And somewhere out there, beyond the thin membrane of buffalo hide that separates you from certain death, something moves in the dark. You do not look. You do not need to, because you are inside. And inside is everything. You feel the warmth of the fire before you see it. A low, steady breath of heat rising from the center of the tipi, licking the air upward through the smoke hole above. The smell of burning wood and ash fills your lungs. Around you, bodies breathe slowly in sleep. Your children pressed close. Your grandmother wrapped in thick bison robes, her breath rising in small white clouds even here, even beside the fire. The hides overhead creak and pull against their poles. The whole structure shivers slightly in a gust, then holds. It always holds, and then, quietly, without warning, your body reminds you of something. Something no history book ever talks about. Something no documentary ever shows. Nature calls. Not tomorrow, not when the storm passes. Now, the temperature outside will freeze exposed skin in under 4 minutes. There are no walls between you and the darkness. No door you can close behind you. No plumbing, no outhouse. Just the howling black cold and a crowded, sacred living space you cannot afford to foul. So what do? This is the question that rewrites everything. Because the answer, the real answer, is not what you expect. And by the time this story is finished, you will never use the word civilized the same way again. Welcome to Primal Echoes, where the past does not whisper, it roars. Here is what most people picture when they think of a winter teepee. Snow falling softly outside, almost peaceful. A warm amber glow from within. Families laughing, children sleeping, elders telling stories beside a crackling fire. It feels timeless, it feels romantic, and honestly, it feels earned. Because the tipi really was one of the most ingenious structures ever built by human hands. Engineers who have studied its design describe it as almost aerodynamically perfect. The conical shape deflects wind rather than fighting it. The angled poles create structural tension that gets stronger under pressure, and the smoke flaps at the top can be adjusted like a valve, pulling fresh air in from the bottom while pushing smoke out from the top. In conditions that would collapse a modern tent in minutes, the tipi held, night after night, storm after storm. It was not primitive shelter. It was precision engineering wrapped in buffalo hide. But here is the paradox no one talks about. The same design that kept the cold out could not keep biology out. And biology, as it turns out, does not care about elegant engineering. It does not wait for the storm to pass. It does not respect the sacred space of a shared home. When you are living in a structure roughly 15 feet across, sharing every inch of that space with your entire family, sometimes 8, 10, 12 people breathing the same air, sleeping within arm's reach of one another, the question of what happens when nature calls in the dead of winter is not a small question. It is a survival question. And dismissing it with a simple, "they just went outside," is not just wrong. It is a failure to understand what -30 degrees actually means to a human body. At -30, exposed skin begins to freeze in under 4 minutes. At -30, a blizzard can reduce visibility to 0 in seconds. At -30, the wolves and the bears that prowled the edges of winter camps were not myths. They were a documented reality that shaped every decision made after dark. Stepping outside in those conditions was not inconvenient. It was potentially fatal, especially for children, especially for the elderly, especially alone, in the dark, half asleep, with the wind screaming and the fire already fading behind you. So the myth that Native Americans simply stepped outside and handled their needs in the snow, that myth needs to die, because what actually happened was something far more thoughtful, far more sophisticated, and honestly, far more human than anything that myth allows for. And this is where the story gets interesting. What you have heard so far, the engineering, the cold, the biology, that is only the surface. What lies beneath it will genuinely change the way you think about what it means to be civilized. Because civilization, it turns out, is not measured by the tools you build. It is measured by how you treat each other in the moments when no one is watching. And these people, in the coldest, darkest, most exposed conditions imaginable, got that right in ways that most modern societies still have not. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what actually happened. Not the romanticized version, not the sanitized museum exhibit version, but the real, functional, ingeniously designed system that kept families healthy, dignified, and alive through winters that most modern people cannot even begin to comprehend. It starts with ash. Simple, gray, unremarkable ash. The thing you scrape out of a fireplace and throw away without a second thought. But inside a winter teepee, ash was not waste. Ash was a resource. Every fire produced it in steady supply, and the people who lived by that fire understood something that took Western science centuries to formally confirm. That wood ash is naturally alkaline, with a pH high enough to neutralize odors, absorb moisture, and actively suppress bacterial growth. Picture this. It is the deep middle of the night, the fire has burned low, and a woman moves quietly through the sleeping bodies around her. She does not wake anyone. She does not need to. She reaches for a small pouch near the entrance. Ash, collected and kept dry, and with a practiced, silent gesture, she covers what needs to be covered. The smell disappears, the air stays clean, and by morning, no one in that teepee is the wiser. That is not primitive improvisation. That is applied chemistry, passed down through generations, long before anyone had a word for chemistry at all. Alongside ash, dry earth, and fine sand served a similar purpose, kept in small hide containers near the entrance, ready for exactly these moments. And then there was snow, clean, fresh snow, which in the depths of a Great Plains winter was available in almost unlimited supply, functioned as what you might call nature's own flush system. It could cleanse hands, wipe surfaces, and seal waste outdoors almost instantly in sub-zero temperatures, freezing it solid before it could contaminate anything. There is something almost beautiful about that, the very harshness of the environment becoming one of its most effective sanitation tools. But the natural toolkit did not stop there, and this next part surprises almost everyone. Sage and cedar, plants that most people associate with ceremony and spiritual practice, were also used for their very real antibacterial and aromatic properties. Bundles of dried sage burned near the living area purified the air in a way that was both practical and deeply meaningful, because in these cultures, cleanliness of body and cleanliness of spirit were never separate categories. They were the same thing. And then there was something even more unexpected: moss. Specific varieties of natural moss, soft and absorbent, harvested and dried before the winter, served as what was essentially the world's first toilet paper. Generations before the concept existed in the so-called civilized world, these communities had already solved that problem, quietly and completely, using nothing but what the land provided. Now, none of this happened by accident. And that brings us to the second layer of this system. The tipi itself, understood not just as a shelter, but as a living machine designed with sanitation in mind. The smoke flaps at the top were not simply for ventilation. They were actively managed throughout the day and night, adjusted to create a consistent upward draft that pulled air, and with it, any odors, continuously upward and out. The result was a structure that essentially breathed, cycling fresh air in from the base and exhausting used air through the top, around the clock. Combined with the constant low heat of the central fire, this meant that the interior atmosphere of a well-managed teepee was, by any reasonable measure, cleaner than many indoor environments today. The physical layout of the space was equally deliberate. Sleeping and gathering areas were arranged around the central fire in a way that gave warmth priority to elders and children, while the spaces nearest the entrance, the coolest, most accessible corners, were reserved for storage, tools, and when necessary, discrete temporary receptacles fashioned from bark, folded hide, or woven material. These were not hidden out of shame. They were placed there out of practicality and design intelligence. And when privacy was needed, hides and folded blankets could be positioned within seconds, not as an afterthought, but as a built-in feature of how the space was intended to function. Architecture, it turns out, can be an act of dignity. And then there is the dimension that no blueprint can capture, the social architecture, the unspoken rules that held the whole system together. Inside a winter teepee, privacy was not created by walls. It was created by people, by an understood, collective agreement that certain moments belong to the individual, and the community's role is to look away, stay quiet, and ask nothing. Elders did not sit children down and explain this. They demonstrated it through their own behavior, their own restraint, their own quiet respect, and children learned by watching, the way humans have always learned the things that matter most. There was no embarrassment in this system. There was no shame. There was only the recognition that every human being, regardless of age or status, deserves to move through their most vulnerable moments with their dignity intact. And that recognition, that simple, profound recognition, was built into the daily life of these communities as naturally as the fire at the center of the teepee. But what happened inside the teepee was only part of the story. Because when the storm cleared, and when the camp woke, and when the scale of the challenge expanded from one family to an entire winter settlement, the system expanded with it. And what these communities built at that larger scale is honestly the most surprising part of all. When the storm finally broke and the winter camp stirred back to life, the challenge of sanitation did not shrink. It multiplied. Because a winter settlement was not one teepee, it was many. Dozens of families, hundreds of people, all living in close proximity, through months of cold so severe that the ground itself was frozen solid. And yet these communities did not collapse into disease, did not foul their own water sources, did not turn their camps into the kind of biological disaster zones that you might expect when that many human beings share that small a space for that long. The reason why comes down to something that sounds almost too simple: planning. Deliberate, systematic, sophisticated planning that began before the first pole of the first teepee was ever raised. Winter camp locations were chosen not only for wind protection and access to wood and water, but specifically with sanitation in mind. Latrine areas were designated at a safe distance from living quarters and always downwind, downhill, and downstream from any water source the community depended on. After each use, these areas were covered with snow, with earth, with bark, sealing them from animals, containing odor, and preventing any contamination from spreading. When conditions were too dangerous to make that walk, waste was temporarily stored inside in covered containers and emptied at the first safe opportunity. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was left to individual judgment in a way that could harm the group. The system protected everyone. The grandmother who could no longer move quickly through deep snow. The infant who could not be taken outside at all. The sick elder whose body had already been weakened by the cold. No one was left outside the protection of that system. No one was considered too inconvenient to accommodate. Now hold that image in your mind for a moment, and then consider this. In 1854, the City of London, the largest, wealthiest, most technologically advanced city on the planet at that time, was killing its own people by the thousands because it was dumping raw human waste directly into the River Thames, the same river from which it drew its drinking water. A single cholera outbreak that year killed over 600 people in 10 days, in one neighborhood alone. The city that had gas lighting and steam engines and the most sophisticated financial system in the world had not yet figured out what a small band of people on the frozen Great Plains had known for 10,000 years: that you do not put your waste where your water is, that you protect the vulnerable first, that the health of one is the responsibility of all. So who, exactly, was primitive, and who was civilized? Because greatness, real greatness, has never been measured by what you build. It has always been measured by how you take care of each other, especially in the moments that are difficult, unglamorous, and invisible to history. And perhaps the most powerful proof of that truth is this. Picture a grandmother, her hands weathered by decades of plains winters, kneeling beside a small fire in the deep of the night. Beside her, a child, maybe 4 years old, maybe 5, watches with wide, serious eyes. The grandmother reaches for the ash pouch without a word. She shows the child what to do. She does it slowly, deliberately, with a kind of quiet reverence that makes the gesture feel like more than what it is. And in that silence, 10,000 years of knowledge passes from one pair of hands to another. No classroom, no textbook, no ceremony. Just a woman, a child, and the understanding that some things are too important to leave to chance, and too sacred to require explanation. So let's come back to the question we opened with. What does it mean to be civilized? Because we started this story inside a tipi, in the dark, in the cold, facing a problem that no one in history class ever talks about. And what we found, when we actually looked, when we stopped romanticizing and started paying attention, was not primitiveness. It was precision. It was a system built from ash and snow, and moss, and silence, that protected human dignity in conditions so extreme that most of us would not last a single night. And here is what makes that even more remarkable. The world is only now catching up. Researchers working on sustainable sanitation in developing regions today are documenting the antibacterial properties of wood ash as a viable alternative to chemical disinfectants. Environmental engineers, studying low-waste systems in communities without plumbing infrastructure, are arriving at solutions that mirror, almost exactly, what these communities practiced for thousands of years. The knowledge was never lost. It was just ignored by people who were too convinced of their own advancement to look at what had already been solved. The most sophisticated bathroom system in human history was not built from porcelain and pipes. It was built from fire and snow, and the quiet, unshakable agreement that every person, no matter how young, how old, how sick, or how small, deserves to move through this life with their dignity intact. That was the system. That was the civilization. This is what Primal Echoes exists to find. The knowledge that was buried under centuries of assumption, the wisdom that survived because it worked, and the stories that history forgot to tell because they were too real, too human, too honest to fit neatly into the version of the past we were taught. If this story opened something in you, if you found yourself thinking differently about what strength really looks like, or what it actually means to take care of each other, then there is so much more waiting here. Subscribe to Primal Echoes. Share this with someone who thinks they already know history, because the past is still speaking, and most of us have barely begun to listen.